Hello and welcome. We are going to discuss all things memory today. We are going to dive into a PowerPoint that I have prepared and we will go from there. So, let's do this. Um, let's go from here. All right. So basically what we're going to be going over today is studying and encoding memories, storing and retrieving memories, forgetting, memory construction, and improving memory. So for a little bit. So we're going to talk about a general model of memory. So when it comes to psychology, there's a lot of um, theories that are very similar with one another. So there are going to be some terms and things that come up that are going to be, if you hear the same term, they basically mean the same thing. So I'll try to remember to connect those as we go. So, types of memory. So, what is memory? Basically, it's a series of active systems that receive, store, organize, alter, and recover information. So, basically, we're taking in information through our senses. So, our senses include what we see, hear, taste, smell, touch. And in psychology, we often include what we would call our sixth sense or our intuition. All of that information is coming in. It gets stored and it gets organized in areas of the brain and body. At times, it gets altered when new information comes in or information is lost. And a system of recovering information. So that is the retrieval, recall, recognition process. So types of memory, we're talking about sensory memory, which we already discussed just a little bit, right? So those are the senses that are coming in. We actually receive this information. And then it gets processed in the brain through our occipital lobe, through our auditory association areas, through our motor neurons. Like all of these things are happening in the brain, the spinal cord, the nerve endings. So all of these senses are inputting information, and then our brain gets to decide what to do with it. Is this worth holding on to? What does this mean? So we process that information very, very quickly. And then from sensory information, and sensory information only lasts about 2 seconds, a maximum of 2 seconds. It's also called structural memory. So it's very quick. It happens, every second of the day. And then that turns into short term memory, or what we would call working memory. And this lasts up to about 30 seconds at a time. So this processes information through the process of maintenance rehearsal. So, for instance, if you meet somebody new and they introduce themselves and they give you their name, 31 seconds later, if you don't intentionally practice that name or repeat it in your head or repeat it back to them, oftentimes that name is forgotten. It just leaves us. So we have to practice what's called rehearsal in order to maintain that information for longer than 30 seconds. Once that happens, it gets what's called encoded into long-term memory. So encoding requires some sort of rehearsal, maintenance, storage, so that we can actually bring it up and retrieve it later. This often happens if we're able to associate new information with something we already know. We can build upon something. We are making meaning of it, right? There's a purpose to the information that we've received, and we've applied it to some area in our life that makes sense. So that's really the best way to encode long-term information, is to make sense of it in the real world. So this gives you a basic model of memory. And so sensory information, sensory memory, right? So this is selective attention. And then we go into short-term or working memory. There's got to be some sort of system of maintenance rehearsal. So repeating that name. And then we encode that into storage, and that goes into what we call LTM, or long-term memory, which is something that we can later retrieve. So when we see that person again, we're like, oh, your name is, whatever, your name is Jennifer because you remind me of this other Jennifer that I knew, or whatever the case might be, whatever you associated it with. And then it comes back into that short-term working memory because it's part of your current awareness. So long-term memory is often stored in a way that we're not aware of it all the time. If we were aware of all the information we knew all the time, we would be completely overloaded. So sensory and short-term working memory. So sensory memory, this is fleeting, right? It's just very quick impressions, large capacity, but for a very short period of time. So we're typically not aware of sensory memory. Because if you were aware, again, you would just be overwhelmed with sensation. Um, what we call visual memory is iconic memory. Okay, it's a mental image or visual representation, typically stores visual sensory images for about half a second. And then echoic memory, this is a brief connotation of sensory activity in the auditory system. So after a sound is heard. During echoic memory, what is often referred to as well as phonemic memory is you're often listening for meaning behind the language or the tone. You're listening for certain sounds. So certain sounds mean either something disastrous is happening, or you're in love, or it's something compassionate and affectionate as opposed to angry and dangerous. So we're always listening for those meanings when it comes to echoic memory as well. So all of those senses have a purpose. So short-term working memory continued, thought to have small capacity and relatively short duration. So for about a dozen seconds, it says here. So, but this is can maintain for probably up to about 30 seconds. So information is subject to mental activity, evaluation, comparison with other things that we know. So if we can quickly associate something that we want to remember with something else, with something we already know, or apply it, then we can begin to encode that into long-term memory. Otherwise, it's gone. The capacity for working memory. So the amount of information held in working memory depends on whether the information is comprised of sounds, mental images, or a combination of the two. So again, when we can combine iconic and echoic memory, the better chance there is to actually solidify that, or what we call consolidate that information into long-term memory. So information bits. So according to Miller, memory is limited to 7 plus or minus 2 seconds. When it comes to this the working memory. Chunking is the process of grouping similar or meaningful information together. So this can be really, really helpful when you want to remember something. So if you're listening to a lecture like this one, maybe, and you're like, oh, I need to remember what chunking is. And then you associate with chunking like, oh yeah, I did this process when I was working on this paper a year ago, whatever the case might be. So chunking recodes or reorganizes information into units that are already in long-term memory. So if you've associated with something, suggests working memory holds about 4 to 7 units of information. So we don't have an unlimited capacity when it comes to working memory. It's got to be in chunks. Otherwise, we lose that bits of information. So if you're one who's like, I'm going to study the entire chapter the night before, the exam, it's probably not the best idea, right? There's far too much information. Your best bet is to chunk it down, and every night you study another topic of that chapter. So makes most efficient use of space in working memory. So when it comes to chunking, this is a really good way to actually remember things that are important to you that you want to retrieve later on. So storage and rehearsal. Maintenance rehearsal, again, repeating the same sounds over and over keeps them in your working memory. So again, repeating that name, whether it's in your head or back to them, or if you can associate their name with something else that you already know or someone else that you already know. So without rehearsal, memories rapidly decay from memory. So they just disappear. Rote rehearsal, so learning simply by repetition, by saying or doing over and over and over again. Elaborate rehearsal, so this makes information more meaningful. It's a better way to form lasting memories. The more meaningful that you can make information, the better off you are when it comes to trying to retrieve that information later on. So forms links between new and existing information, what we also call integration. So when you've got a set of old information and you add new information to it, that's what we call integration. And when you can integrate things, this is when we innovate. This is when we're much more creative, but also when we remember things the most. So when we can apply those things. and link them together. So, personal reflection. So, this is just give you something to think about. In what ways can you use the process of elaborate rehearsal when studying for classes and exams? So, again, when it comes to elaborate rehearsal, we're talking about making meaning of things. Elaborate rehearsal can also include teaching someone else. So, this is a really good sign of mastery. If you can teach someone else about something, chances are you've got a really good handle on it. So that elaborate rehearsal can be creating a story around it, making associations, making it meaningful, having some sort of purpose to it. So all of those wonderful things. So when you have things that you want to remember, just remember, make meaning. So long-term memory. So this is after or during the process of short-term memory or working memory into long-term memory requires encoding. So this is a storage system that can hold a lot of information for a lengthy period of time, sometimes for decades. Sometimes you only need it for about a year, and then you're like, I haven't used that information and it disappeared from me, right? So then we need to relearn things. Storage based on meaning, so encoded as images or sounds, or both. So the idea that information is stored as a set of abstract concepts based on what information means to you. So meaning attributed to various concepts, cultural adaptation. So this varies from person to person. We don't all believe that the same things are meaningful, and we all have different values, beliefs, and things that we associate information with. So, or things that we actually find important. So when it comes to long-term memory, it is possible to hang on to this information for a very long period of time. Organization is based on networks. So memories linked in terms of their meaning will be stored together. So if you've got memories that are highly emotional, oftentimes those emotional memories will be linked together. So if you find yourself waking up and you have, they call it flashbulb in some texts call it a flashback, right? So if you've had some traumatic experience and that memory has come back as a flashback, it's very emotional. And if you start your day that way, chances are other memories that have the same emotional connection will begin to peak up during your day, or you'll find yourself in that same emotional state throughout the day. Because those memories, again, they're linked together. So if they've got emotion, if they've got the same visual context, if they've got the same echoic or audio kind of context, if you wake up with certain songs in your head, oftentimes those songs continue to play in your head throughout the day. So these things are linked together. So the network model explains the structure of long-term memory, retrieval cues. These are triggers in your environment that actually bring up specific memories. So retrieval cues can be anything from seeing something, hearing something, smelling something, tasting something. So again, retrieval cues are associated with our senses. And then reintegration. So complete memory can be retrieved from partial cues or reminders. So when we're like we're not quite sure about the whole memory, but we remember just a tiny little bit of our childhood from this or that, and then we smell something, and then part of that memory that we thought was lost reappears or becomes part of our awareness. So when it comes to memories that are encoded with emotion, those don't often disappear. They are stored within the brain and the body. And they are often brought about by what we call retrieval cues, or you might know as triggers. So types of long-term memory. Implicit memory lies outside of awareness. So implicit, it is deep, deep down. Explicit stores information from your personal life. It's factual information. This is stuff that you can easily retrieve. It's in your present awareness. So here is a little diagram of memory, that memory model that we began with. So sensory memory, again, very, very short term, up to about 2 seconds, and is based on what we see and hear, taste, touch, feel, smell, all those wonderful things. And then into working memory. And then we have to actually practice what we want to maintain. And so long-term memory then is encoded through that rehearsal process. So implicit memory and explicit memory, obviously these are two separate things. We also call implicit memory the unconscious or subconscious, and then implicit memory is part of what we call semantic memory and episodic memory. Semantic memory is also called declarative or factual memory. So these are those things when we talk about different models and theories in psychology, um, depending on who wrote the book, right, on it, is going to call it different things. So again, think of implicit as unconscious, explicit as conscious. Semantic memory is often declarative or factual. These are the things that I know, and I can tell you easily what they are. And then episodic memories are just one episode in time. So they are um, those things that, well, we'll start with semantic memory. So, semantic or factual memory, this might be I say tree, and you either see the word tree, you see an actual tree, you see a specific tree, but you know what a tree is. Okay, that is semantic memory. It's declarative, it's factual. You've got it. It's just part of who you are. That memory was formed and encoded early on, and it was reinforced throughout your lifetime. So you know what a tree is. Episodic memory is when I was 8 years old, I sat under a tree and ate a birthday cake. That is one episode in time, right? It's got time, it's got person, it's got a place. If you can think of it like this, if you watch any kind of TV series, it's one episode in the season, right? And then one episode in the season, you would add all of those up together, you'd create this much larger story. And that's what we call autobiographical memory. And autobiographical memory combines our factual memory and our episodic memory to create a whole narrative, a story of our life that makes sense. So and I'll create a different video when we start to get to stress and trauma and how all of that impacts memory. I might talk about a little bit in here, but basically what happens is semantic memory and episodic memory sort of lives in the left side of the brain. And we know the left side of the brain has a lot to do with logic, language. It's linear. So these are the things that are very orderly. The right side of the brain is our meaning maker, right? It sees things holistically. And the left side sees things in parts. So the right side is necessary. It's the right side is also very emotional. So the right side is necessary for combining emotion and meaning with the parts of our life, right? So it's got to combine all of these things to make a narrative that makes sense from beginning to middle to end. So, and we'll talk again about in a different video. About how trauma interrupts that process of making meaning for your entire autobiographical experience. So because things kind of get trapped in the right side, in the emotional side, so it's very difficult to access the left, where it's logical and linguistic, where we've got language and it's linear, it goes from A to B to C. So that's just your basic rundown, right, of the memory model that we have in front of us. So sensory into short term, into long term, and then long term gets split up into what I'm consciously aware of, what I am not consciously aware of. So implicit memory, again, this lies outside of awareness. So those things that require motor or performance skills, typing, driving, these are the things that have gotten practiced over time that they're just automatic now. Classical and instrumental conditioning. And then priming. So long-term memory is organized according to meaning. We already talked about this. So making some information more accessible. So when it comes to implicit memory, the stuff that lies below or outside of our conscious awareness, these can be things that are brought up by retrieval cues. So triggers in our environment can bring these up. Simply me saying, what is 2 + 2? Y'all probably just went 4. Right. So that is it was part of your implicit memory a minute ago, but it's no longer. Now it's part of your explicit, it's part of your conscious awareness. But those are the things that lie below, beneath, outside of, right, the conscious awareness. So And Freud would say that's broken up really into three sections. So we've got consciousness and then subconsciousness and then what we can call unconsciousness. And most of what drives our daily thoughts, feelings, and behaviors lies in the unconscious. So the conscious part is really what we're aware of, what's happening in the present moment. Subconscious is just below our awareness. We can easily retrieve information like what is 2 plus 2, is 4. That lies in your subconscious. And then the unconscious, that implicit, deep buried long-term memory, those are often things that don't come up unless there is some sort of retrieval cue or trigger from the environment. Explicit memory, so this stores information for to form personal life, names, faces, words, dates, ideas, right? This is how we keep track of our daily life. Semantic memory, again, also called declarative or factual memory. So this is knowledge about the world. And so some knowledge is almost immune to forgetting. So if it's completely ingrained in us, if we were primed earlier on for certain things, those things just don't leave us. Episodic memory, again, autobiographical, personal experience, life events, unless important, easily forgotten. However, the episodic memory is not autobiographical memory. It's necessary for autobiographical memory. So episodic memory is a part, it's a piece, but it's not the entire experience. It's one episode in time. So consolidation. So once formed, information is fairly lasting. You must sleep. You must go through at least 3 to 4 waves of, your sleep cycle in order for the information of the day to be solidified or consolidated into long-term memory. So if you find yourself forgetting things often, ask yourself first, am I sleeping well at night? So this can be prevented with electroconvulsive shock. So those who have what we call shock therapy for whatever reason, if they've got epilepsy or mental health disorder that a doctor seems to be necessary for that. I don't know if that would be necessary, but whatever. That's just my personal opinion. So recent memories are more easily disrupted than older memories. So the hippocampus is important in consolidation. So part of the limbic system and it acts as a switch between working and long-term memory. So again, we'll talk again in another video about the role of the hippocampus or the limbic system in memory and learning, and also emotion, right? Is vital. So the hippocampus has to be online. It has to be working and functioning properly in order for the sensory memory and the working memory to be encoded into long-term memory. The hippocampus is our integration system. It's taking what I know with new information, linking it together, making meaning of it, making sense of it. And when the hippocampus is not online, when it's not functioning, if it's overloaded with emotion, this does not work and our long-term memory becomes faulty, or it does not integrate the new information that's coming in. It disrupts learning and retrieval. So why long-term memory matters, or why you can't just Google everything. So some advantages to long-term memory: retrieval of information is faster when already stored in long-term memory. So again, you don't need to Google what is 2 plus 2. You already know. Mundane tasks are more efficient, and there's an increased ability to understand information and remember it later. This is also super important now that we've come up in a day and age where AI has become a go-to as far as answers go. But you have to understand that AI is completely fallible because it was set up by humans. The information is gathered digitally, and so there's no there's no accountability unless you actually know fact from fiction. So it's very important to use AI appropriately. It is not a mechanism to be your long-term memory. So there are some definite disadvantages to depending on AI to retrieve information for you because it's often faulty. So remembering and forgetting, factors that improve encoding. So anything that is more emotionally driven is going to be encoded deeper. than something that is not. So, positive correlation between intensity of emotion and ability to remember. So, when we say positive, we don't mean that it's happy, awesome, amazing. We just mean a positive correlation. As one goes up, the other also goes up. The more emotional something is, or the more emotion you feel during an event or an experience, the more likely you are to remember that event later on. Flashbulb memory, or what we call flashbacks in psychology, recollections that are detailed or unusually vivid. Um, and these can happen when implicit memory is triggered, right? A retrieval cue happens, and oftentimes with folks who have PTSD or complex post-traumatic stress disorder, will often have what we call flashbulb or flashback memories. So these activate the limbic system, but are not always accurate, which there's some debate about that. We'll talk about that in a minute, but there's some debate about emotional and false memories and these kind of things. So the present day psychologists have um, almost definitively concluded that the more emotionally driven an experience is, the less likely it is to be altered in any way, right? The more factual it is, and it's repeated in the same um, detail, right, as it was the first time. So there's some debate on whether or not emotion plays a role when it comes to or at least a debate between psychologists. Now, I tend to fall on the line of the more emotionally driven it is, the more solidified it is, and the less likely it is to be vulnerable to alterations or what they call false memories. So deep processing. So think about the object and its meaning. Consider connections to it in memory network. So levels of processing effect. So this is deep processing, more likely to be encoded than that which is superficial information. So this is just common sense stuff, right? If it's more meaningful to you, the chances are you're actually going to remember it. So factors that do not improve encoding. Your intention to remember has zero to do with your ability to remember. So intention does not equal correlation to encoding. So just because I want to doesn't mean it's going to happen. You have to practice it. You have to, do that elaborate rehearsal. You have to make some meaning of it, or use some tools like chunking or pneumatic devices, if you will, like turning whole sentences into like, one word, or phrases into one word. So repeated exposure to information does not produce encoding. So just because you see it over and over and over and over again, or you hear it over and over and over and again, does not mean that it's sticking, does not mean that it's being consolidated or encoded. So again, with things like flashcards, those can be very helpful. However, unless you associate flashcards or what's on the flashcards with something that makes sense in the real world, it often doesn't stick. So if you're teaching a child 2 plus 2 and you just show them 2 plus 2 over and over again, they might eventually get it. But if you say, here's 2 plus 2, here's what it looks like, it equals 4, and then you whip out 2 oranges and 2 apples, and you have them count 2 oranges plus 2 apples equals 4 pieces of fruit, that has a lot more meaning to it than a flashcard with 2 plus 2. So measuring your ability to retrieve information. So this is the tip of the tongue, and inability to locate or retrieve a complete memory. So without active recall, recognition, or relearning, oftentimes things escape our memory, if you will, or at least escape to a certain degree. Sometimes we have that tip of the tongue moment, and then an hour later we're like, oh, that was it, that was the name, or that was where I left my keys. So that happens quite often. So with these different techniques, what we have is recall. So this is direct retrieval of facts or information with minimal cues. So serial position effect. So serial position effect is really interesting, because if I read off a list of words from 1 to 12, right? I read you 12 words, and you have 1 minute to write down every word that you remember. Chances are you remembered the first and last more than you remembered anything else in the middle. So this is especially true if you're a performer, right? Your chances of being remembered are best when you are either the headline, you're the first or you're the last to go, right? They remember those things. People remember those things better when it is positioned first and last. We sort of had that muddy middle, if you will. So, recognition as previously learned information can be correctly identified when presented. So, basically, you recognize, oh, yeah, that's what that is because you were presented with some sort of cue, visual or auditory cue, or even a smell, right? So, that can be part of that too. So just recognizing things can bring up memories. Relearning, so most sensitive measure of memory. So relearning something over and over again can help solidify or encode information. And this often happens if we've been in a career for a while and we started out and we knew all this information and then several years went by and we're like, we didn't really use that, but now we've got to take some sort of state licensing exam. Then we're going to need to relearn some things. So forgetting, this occurs quickly before consolidation. So this is just an example or some curve on forgetting. So information connected to the long-term memory is not lost nearly as quickly. So when we talk about once it's been consolidated, right? If we practice those things, basically our retention, our what he calls savings score percentage, um, right, remains fairly consistent. So our ability to immediately recall, and then 20 minutes later, we hang on to about 70% of that information. And then an hour later, about 55%. 2 days later, we're looking at about 25% of that information. And that stays fairly consistent up to about 31 days. So we have to continually really, if we want to keep that information refreshed in our explicit memory, we have to continue to do that rehearsal, the maintenance rehearsal. Um, so why forgetting happens? Of course, age has a lot to do with that. So also physical and nutrition, what we put into our body, what we do with our body, all of that matters. What's in our environment, all of those things really attack what's called the telomeres, right? The little protective caps at the end of our chromosomes. When those begin to decay, that is the aging process. So based on what we feed ourselves and what we do with our minds and our bodies really does matter. So Alzheimer's, dementia, amnesia, retrograde amnesia, antegrade amnesia. So retrograde is you've forgotten everything from the past. Antegrade is you remember everything from the past, but you forget everything that you do in the present day. So and then cue dependent forgetting. So state dependent learning, so both physical and emotional states. So again, if we're in some emotional state, that can really impact the way that we actually learn something. Interference, so there's a little graph here on interference, or what can interrupt our ability to either learn new information um, or lose old information, right? So retroactive, basically you've learned something already, and here comes interference. You've learned something completely new that's related to the first thing that you learned, and it overrides or interferes with what you've already learned, right? So there's memory loss for the first thing that you learned. And then proactive, you've already learned something, so this is old information. Here comes the new information, and you're like, it doesn't click, it doesn't make sense, there's no meaning to it. So the old information stays and the new information is lost. And there's Milton, I apologize. Okay, so motivated forgetting, so repression or suppression, so really with or without intention, losing long-term memory, and often due to traumatic experiences. So an updated view on forgetting, so active versus passive forgetting, so decay theory. So this memory traces which are changes in neurons or brain activity passively passively decay or weaken over time. The cat's moving the table, there we go. Thorndike's law on disuse. So over time, memories and long-term memory that were not often retrieved would eventually decay or be forgotten. And I would say the caveat to this is if something is deeply emotionally encoded, those don't tend to decay or be forgotten. They're often brought up with retrieval cues. Um, the accuracy of long-term memory. So we talked a little bit already about false memories. Uh, and our memories, our typical everyday memories are subject to, are vulnerable to alteration. If you have any siblings and you're like, I remember Easter this one year and da da da, this happened and that happened, and your siblings like, nope, that's not how it happened, right? And the more we tell it, something else gets tweaked a little bit, right? So you're like, I had a pink bike, and your sister's like, no, it was purple. So those things happen, and it's a natural thing that actually happens. But the more emotionally charged a memory is, the more likely it is to be accurate and not subject to change over time. So there's also an assumption that eyewitness testimony is infallible, is incorrect. So when it comes to it depends on how emotionally charged that memory was, and how well it was encoded and consolidated in long-term memory. So recovered memories of hidden memories of abuse. So things like hypnosis, guided visualization, suggestion, age regression, truth drugs, and other techniques can elicit fantasies, be mistaken for real memories. This can happen, but it's relatively rare. So false memory, a memory that can seem accurate but is not, and then this false memory syndrome, being subjected to planting of a false memory. So um, I will bring your attention to the 1980s, when there was what we call the satanic panic. And this whole idea of a false memory syndrome was actually created. And the False Memory Syndrome Foundation was developed. And this is where we would pause and say, well, what the heck was happening here? Because there was a group of children in a child care facility who had all come up with the same memory, and they determined that those memories had been planted. They had been um, suggested to the children, and all the children had the same story of satanic ritual abuse. Well, from then on, all children basically who were saying, hey, I'm being abused, they weren't believed because it was blamed on this false memory syndrome. Um, but what happened was, this false memory syndrome that was labeled and then later became a foundation was also driven and controlled by pedophiles. So we have to look at this and go, okay, what is the foundation here? What is the sort of the mechanism behind this whole idea? And the False Memory Syndrome Foundation actually went bankrupt and out of business, if you will. So so take this with a grain of salt, really, when it comes to this. We don't have really good scientific accurate ways to determine in the brain, really, what's false memory and what is not. But less than 2% of those who, excuse me while I move this around because my cat's wanting to attack all the wires. Less than 2% of those who actually disclose sexual abuse are either making it up or fabricating some part of it. So, 98% of those who actually disclose are telling the truth. So we have to look at these things and be like, what is it really? So present day psychologists argue that the more emotionally charged a situation is, the more accurate the memory recall. So I would point you to Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, Dr. Daniel Siegel, The Neurobiology of We. And this is a recorded lecture series. It's very good if you can get your hands on it. Peter Levine, in An Unspoken Voice and Waking the Tiger, he did some other ones as well, and talks a lot about how memory is stored within the body. So those are some great resources for you from present day psychologists. So moving on to improving your memory. So strategies for improving, again, we talked about chunking. So these are, associating things with everyday life, putting information into meaningful groups. So again, about 4 to 7 pieces of information within a group, and then rehearsing those things. elaborate rehearsal. So the more you rehearse the information, the better you'll remember it. Look for connections to existing knowledge. So again, if we're looking for connections, if we're linking things together, we're integrating. Spaced practice. So short study sessions with brief rest periods. So your brain can only absorb so much at a time. And then you need rest to actually encode that information. You need good sleep at night to encode that information. Mental images, especially vivid ones or mixed words and images. So the more that you can combine your echoic and iconic memory, the more likely you are to remember what you'd like to remember. So, whole versus parts learning. So, study the largest meaningful amount of the information that you can at one time. So, progressive part method for long, complex material. So, if you have an entire chapter, or say you've got to memorize, not memorize maybe, but you've got to know an entire law book, right? You're going to study the entire meaning of the whole first and then break it down into parts. Okay. Serial position effects. So give extra practice to the middle information. So if you're putting together long lists, chances are you're going to remember the first and the last. So take that middle part out and make a new list. And so the middle part, then some of that becomes the first and the last. Okay. And then overlearn, continue beyond bare mastery. So in order to teach someone else a specific topic or subject, you really need to know much more than you're actually teaching, especially if you've got students with questions or you've got an audience with questions. It's very important that you know more information about the topic. So mnemonics, this is imposing an artificial organization on material if there is none that is naturally presented. So when it comes to mnemonics, you can actually create what's called acrostics, right? So first letter of the word to be used to create a sentence. So for instance, if you were learning musical scales, every good boy does fine, right? So E, G, B, D, F. And I remember that from 8 years old. So that's an acrostics. I made a sentence out of letters that needed to be memorized. So keyword method, familiar words or images linked to other words or items. So attaching the word shoe to foot or toes kind of thing. It's a weird example, but you get the idea. Other forms of mnemonic, like when we talk about SMART goals, right? SMART doesn't mean you're super smart, right? It's specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time bound, right? So created a word out of other words so that you can remember easily. Okay, that's a SMART goal. Create stories of change. So mental images connect each item to being remembered. So one of my students, I had read them a list of 12 words, and they had actually, as I was reading, they were creating a story with each of the words, and the words didn't make any sense on their own, but they had connected them in a way that made sense to them. Right. So part of it was, the daughter went to a fence and she had a friend who climbed a tree. And there were just all these different connections she had made to create the story. And it was very creative and ingenious, if you will. So psychology and your skill set. So giving memorable presentations. Many of you will need to be giving presentations. Many of you hate giving presentations. I don't know why. It's like one of the biggest fears out there is public speaking. However, if you have some simple techniques, you'll get through it just fine. So multimedia principle, people process words and mental images together better than words alone. So the idea that my little face is up here in the corner somewhere, right? And we've got pictures and images combined with words on a PowerPoint hopefully helps you remember things better. So some of the models that I showed, hopefully that helps you remember better. So 3 assumptions. People process through 2 sensory channels, visual and verbal. And some process through others, but you're not necessarily going to have people smell things or taste things or do hands-on type things. People can only process a limited amount of information through either channel at any given time. So it's going to be important to say things and present things at the same time so they can choose either one. So they can either look at the words and say, oh, I can see that visually. They can look at the model and they can see that visual, or they can hear the audio, right? The voice that's presenting the information. So, but they don't typically process both at the same time, and they can relatively close period of time together, but you get the idea. So people remember best when they select important information from sensory memory. So organize it in a meaningful way and integrate it with other information. So make stories of your presentations, make meaning of your presentations. So coming up with examples are really great ways for people to understand and process what you are presenting to them. Speak to your audience's memory. So help audience select important information by eliminating distractions, eliminate anything that does not support the main idea. So we talked this entire presentation, this entire video is about memory. Limit number of points per slide. Now I tend to get off on this a little bit sometimes and I'll put way too many. Highlight important points. So that is something I tend to do. I don't want to put too much information in there. And then use a headline instead of a title. So, and that's, preference for you. So I don't think people are going to go, oh my gosh, she used a headline instead of a title. Help audiences organize information. Keep your eye on the whole story. Make structure of points clear and talk over the picture. So that's exactly what we've done today. And the entire point of this presentation is that in order for you to consolidate memory into long-term memory is for you to make meaning of it, is for you to integrate what you know with new information and make it make sense, right? So help your audience integrate information by helping them make connections, connect to long-term memory of their own personal experience. And then when it comes to presenting things, of course, you're going to want to practice, practice, practice. It doesn't just naturally happen for some people. It takes quite a while to get the hang of presenting to others, especially in a very Zoom type world. It's very strange now. So self-assessment. So can you explain how we encode, store, and retrieve information? Compare sensory with working memory, distinguish between implicit and explicit memory. Can you outline the parts of the brain that are important for memory? Outline ways to better retrieve or forget information and memories. Can you discuss how and why false memories occur? So that is basically that is the end of our presentation today on memory models, and how we encode from sensory, or what we call structural, to working or short-term memory into long-term memory. How do we encode those things? How to remember things? How do we learn things better? And how do we retrieve information in a way that's helpful? So I hope that is helpful for you. If you have any questions, you can, send me a message, leave it in the comments, whatever works for you. And that's all I've got. I hope you have a great day. Bye.